So last week we talked about primary language support, and I mentioned that this week we would be talking about translanguaging, which was a term that came up in last week's material and information. Translanguaging and primary language support are very much similar ideas. They both deal with including the home language into the instruction to better support English language learners. So as we get into this, you'll see it's a very short presentation, and some of the ideas are very similar for that reason. So TESOL, which stands for Teaching English to Students of Other Languages, they have an international association that has identified 6 principles for exemplary teaching of English language learners. And so the idea is that these core principles that are listed on this slide outline this exemplary teaching, but they should be implemented as a whole. And even though this is not related to SIOP model, this is something separate. Hopefully, as I read through these, you'll see how they are very much connected to what we've been talking about in the SIOP model. So the first principle is to know your learners. So teachers gain information about their learners, and they should embrace and leverage the resources that learners bring to the classroom to further enhance learning. Teachers should also create conditions for language learning. So demonstrating expectations of success for all learners. That goes along with like showing the final product or the end product of assignments. And teachers should also be planning instruction to enhance and support student motivation for language learning. Teachers should be designing high-quality lessons for language development, so preparing lessons with clear outcomes and convey them to students. We talked about that with our objectives, and providing and enhancing input through varied approaches, techniques, and modalities, using a variety of things to better allow students to access the information. Teachers should adapt lesson delivery as needed. So this goes along with like pacing. So they should be checking student comprehension frequently and adjusting instruction according to learner responses. And they should be adjusting their talk, the task, or the materials according to learner responses. So really gauging understanding with those formative assessments and then redirecting if needed. Teachers should monitor and assess student language development. So monitoring student errors and providing ongoing effective feedback strategically, which we've talked about what kind of feedback is most beneficial for students. And the last principle here is that teachers should engage and collaborate within a community of practice. So teachers should be fully engaged in their profession and collaborating with one another, especially if you have a co-teacher or you're co-planning with someone else like an ESL teacher. So support for a translanguaging pedagogy. We know that translanguaging specifically refers to the ways bilingual and multilingual students draw on all of their linguistic resources to make meaning as they communicate and engage in tasks in the classroom and beyond. So they're thinking of, and it allows, and teachers should be thinking of creative ways students use both languages at the word, sentence, paragraph, and conversation level. Sometimes this is also referred to as code switching. I would argue that code switching involves the context also, but sometimes these words are used interchangeably a little bit. It also includes easy bilinguals, especially that they may engage in part of a task in one language and another in their other language. So it's this idea that for some tasks, bilinguals may be discussing in their home language, but then in English for another task, for example. And translanguaging strategies can be used to help students learn academic content while supporting their English language and bilingual development. And this is exactly the idea behind primary language support. It's what we talked about last week. This idea that while students are still working on their language development, English language development, some parts of a lesson, not the entire lesson itself, but parts of a lesson could be delivered in their home language so that they can better understand that content. It can focus on that while they're still working on language development. So the power of an English learner's home language is a resource that's been widely recognized at this point. Though there are still districts and researchers who believe that maybe that's not, home languages don't have a place in the classroom. There's plenty of information now that suggests that that's not the case. In fact, the first principle for exemplary teaching states that teachers should embrace and leverage the resources that ELLs bring to the classroom. And the knowledge of their home language or languages is one of the greatest resources we have as a teacher. So ways that home languages are effectively leveraged are through writing development, so clarification, problem solving. Last week we mentioned doing those preliminary steps in the writing process, doing that in the home language, and then allowing for English afterwards. They also help with reading comprehension because it allows students greater opportunities for learning and teachers opportunities to better teach and support reading comprehension. It assists content and language learning and legitimizes student identity. So I don't know if we mentioned this enough last week, but it's this idea that there's value placed on their home language. So instead of sending this message that there's no place in the classroom for their culture or their language, instead we're showing that there's value to it. Translanguaging must be strategic and conducive to meeting the language learning goals of the classroom. So it really has to be carefully developed, thought about, and implemented into a classroom. You want to avoid just including translations because we know that those can be the most ineffective ways of doing this. And instead of supporting a student and enhancing the development of their language learning, it can actually work in the adverse effect of that. So last week there was mention of concurrent translation. That's the idea that teacher will deliver instruction in English, and then that section of the instruction that was delivered will then be translated into the home language, and the teacher will do the next step in English, and then that's translated. The reason why that's not beneficial is because students who can understand the home language are not using those English development skills. They're ignoring that and just focusing on the translation. So they're not developing their language acquisition while that's happening. And the same idea applies to the substitute text. So sometimes teachers think that just providing the same text but in the translation, that's supporting students. And there are specific times and places where that could be beneficial, but you want to avoid doing that for every reading, especially if it's like a major text or something that's being discussed in the class, because students are not going to refer back to the English version of it. Instead, they'll just focus on the translation in their home language. And so they're not then challenging themselves to develop those language skills any further. So we talked about some of these strategies last week, but just to reiterate this, we know that providing effective translanguaging strategies is easiest when the teacher or a classroom paraprofessional, maybe an ESL teacher or ELD teacher, speaks the home language of the students, but that's not the end all be all. And so last week I really tried to stress that even if you don't speak the home language, there are still ways to allow students to discuss and use their home language to better support their understanding. So there's this preview review strategy where the preview or this little jumpstart lesson, so to speak, would happen at the start of the class. That would be in the home language. Then the bulk of the lesson, the main part of the lesson, would be delivered in English. And then there would be a little conclusion wrap up at the end of the lesson that would also be conducted in the home language, so that there's a way to gauge student understanding at the front end and at the back end. Quick explanations during a whole class or small group instruction could be delivered in the home language. Quick explanations for individual students could be delivered in the home language. Students could be pulled aside to reteach concepts in the home language. There are these read aloud books in the home language. Some of them are dual language books that have both languages there, and that reinforce the concepts that may be taught in English. So this is as a supplementary. You could accept student contributions in the home language, label your classroom in English and the home language, create instructional wall displays in the home language. The use of bilingual dictionaries was another strategy that we talked about, and allowing students to help each other, especially if they all speak the same home language, then that's really beneficial. And this isn't a comprehensive list by any means. Last week we talked about the value of having community volunteers who may speak the home language in the classroom, emailing to parents and seeking parent involvement. All of that would certainly benefit as well.